In today's game, Nash will be piloting Yarok, a creature-based combo deck looking to exploit ETB triggers. His opening hand had a snow-covered forest, ancient tomb, command tower, nature's claim, Deadeye Navigator, Eternal Witness, and Sakashima. Ron will be piloting Ezuri. His opening hand consisted of 2 forests, a Screeb Ranger, Toski, Harmonize, Beast Collar, and Recycle. Jordan will be playing Psy Master Thopters, an artifact control deck based around gaining incremental value off of playing cheap artifacts. His opening hand consists of a Trinket Mage, KCI, a Mana Crypt, Retrofitter Foundry, Ethereum Sculptor, Ponder, and a Snow-Covered Island. Ryan will be piloting Baral, Chief of Compliance, another artifact-based control deck, this time looking to stall out the game and then win through a dramatic combo. His opening hand consisted of 2 islands, a Flooded Strand, a Mana Vault, a Mana Drain, and Brainstorm and Negate. Nash wins the die roll and starts us off with a command tower, and then he passes. Ron draws for turn, plays a forest, and then passes his turn. Jordan draws, and then plays a snow-covered island, followed up by a Mana Crypt. He then taps out to play his Psy Master Thopters. He then passes his turn. Ryan draws and plays an island for turn. Then, he uses 1 mana to play a Mana Vault. Nash draws for turn, and then plays his Ancient Tomb. He then passes. Ron draws, and plays another forest. Uses 1 mana to cast an Elvish Mystic. He then ends his turn. Jordan then draws for turn. On his upkeep, he fails his Crypt trigger and takes 3. He then plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn, followed up by an Ethereum Sculptor. This causes Psy to trigger, making a Thopter. He then plays a Retrofitter Foundry. On ETB, Psy creates a Thopter. He then casts an Ichor Wellspring. And on ETB, Psy creates another Thopter. He then casts a Preordain and scries 1 to top, 1 to bottom. He moves to combat and attacks with Psy at Ryan for 1. Ryan draws for turn. He then casts a Brainstorm, followed up with a Flooded Strand for turn. He then casts a Ponder, putting 3 back on top, and then passes the turn. On end of turn, Nash casts a Nature's Claim on Jordan's Mana Crypt. Nash draws for turn. He then plays a forest as his land for turn. He taps out to cast Panharmonicon, and then passes the turn. Ron draws for the turn. He plays a forest as his land for turn. He then casts Beast Whisperer and passes the turn. Jordan draws for turn. He then plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn. He moves to combat and swings for 5 at Ryan with his Thopters, Ethereum Sculptor, and Psy. On his second main phase, he taps out to cast a Trinket Mage, getting a Skull Clamp to hand. He passes. Ryan draws for turn. He then casts a Ristic Study and Baral, Chief of Compliance, and passes. Nash draws for turn. He plays a City of Brass as his land for turn, and then follows that up with a Gonti, Lord of Luxury. The ETB triggers twice due to the Panharmonicon. and he targets Ryan with both triggers. Ron draws for turn. He then plays a forest as his land for turn. He casts a Screeb Ranger, paying for the Heuristic Study. He then casts a Beastcaller Savant and bounces a land in order to pay for the Heuristic Study. On end of turn, Jordan activates his Foundry to make one of his Thopters into a 4/4 construct. Jordan draws for turn. He then plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land and moves to combat. He swings at Ryan for 7. On the second main phase, Jordan plays a Brainstorm, paying for the Heuristic Study. Then passes his turn. Ryan draws for turn and does not untap Mana Vault, causing him to lose 1 life. He then ends his turn. Nash draws for turn. And then taps out to cast Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, paying the Heuristic Study trigger. It enters the battlefield as a copy of Gonti, Lord of Luxury. Nash targets Jordan with the second trigger of Gonti, the first one to resolve, and Ryan with the first trigger of Gonti, the second one to resolve. Ron draws for turn. He plays a forest as his land for turn. He casts Yeva, Nature's Herald, paying for the Heuristic Study. He then draws a card due to the Beast Whisperer trigger. On end of turn, Jordan uses Sai's ability to sacrifice both a Thopter and Ichor Wellspring, causing a LTB trigger on the Ichor Wellspring, letting him draw a card. He then draws a card due to the resolution of Sai's ability. Jordan also taps his Retrofitter Foundry to convert a Thopter into a construct. Ron then passes the turn. Jordan draws for his turn and swings 9 at Ryan with his 2 constructs and 1 of his Thopters. He then tries to pass the turn. On end of turn, Ryan casts Chain of Vapor, targeting his Mana Vault, returning it to his hand. Ryan draws for turn, and then casts a Mox Diamond, discarding an island. He then replays his Mana Vault and passes. Nash draws for his turn, and then tries to pass. On end of turn, Jordan reality shifts Beast Whisperer, and Ron then pays 2 to flip his manifested Boreal Druid. Ron draws for turn, and plays a forest as his land. He then attempts to cast the Great Henge, paying for the Heuristic Study. Ryan responds by countering it with Remand, causing a trigger on Baral, Chief of Compliance. On end of turn, Jordan uses his Retrofitter Foundry to make a construct. Ron then passes. Jordan draws for turn, and then swings at Ryan for 14. Nash tries to cast a Mystic Confluence in response to Ryan's blockers. choosing the modes bounce and 2 draws. Jordan then tries to cast an Narset's Reversal, paying for Heuristic Study. Ryan tries to cast Delay on Narset's Reversal. Jordan then casts Fierce Guardianship, paying for Heuristic Study. And with the delay countered, Narset's Reversal resolves. Jordan copies Mystic Confluence and picks to bounce Yeva Nature's Herald and to draw 2 cards. At this point, we mistracked life, and Ryan thought he was eliminated, so he starts picking up. On second main, Jordan casts a Springleaf Drum, triggering Psy to make a Thopter. Using the Springleaf Drum to tap the Thopter for mana, he casts a Mystic Remora. He then passes the turn. Nash draws for turn. He plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and then he casts Sylvan Library. He also casts a Bird of Paradise, and then passes the turn. Ron draws for turn, and casts a Soul of the Harvest. He then returns a land using his Screed Ranger to untap a Mana Dork, plays the Forest as his land for turn, and then casts Yorga Tree Speaker. He then finishes off with a Finhorn Elder and passes. On Jordan's turn, he pays the Mystic Remora cost using his Springleaf Drum, tapping down his Ethereum Sculptor. He then draws for turn. He plays a Snow-Covered Island, and then he passes the turn. Nash draws for turn, and then plays a Cryptolith Rite. He then casts a Phantasmal Image, entering the battlefield as a clone of Gonti, Lord of Luxury. Jordan responds by improvising a Whir of Invention X equals 4 to get his Mystic Forge into play. The first Gonti resolves, targeting Jordan, and the second Gonti trigger resolves, also targeting Jordan. Nash then ends the turn. Ron draws for turn, and plays a Forest as his land. He then casts a Great Henge, paying for the Mystic Remora. He then casts Toski, Bearer of Secrets, causing both his Great Henge and Soul of the Harvest to trigger, drawing him 2 cards. He then activates his Screed Ranger, bouncing a land in order to untap his Finehorn Elder. He then taps out to cast Ezuri, Renegade Leader. He passes the turn. On upkeep, Jordan uses Mystic Forge to exile the top card of his library. He then lets Mystic Remora die. He draws a card for turn, and then casts a Mishra's Bauble, causing Psy to trigger, making another Thopter. He then uses Springleaf Drum to tap down his Ethereum Sculptor for mana, to cast a Cloud Key, naming artifacts. This also causes Psy to make another Thopter. He then plays Shimmermere, triggering Psy once again to make another Thopter. And then he cracks the Mishra's Bauble to look at the top card of Ron's library. He then ends his turn. On Nash's upkeep, Jordan draws for the delayed Bauble trigger, and then Nash draws for turn. Nash then moves to combat and swings with his Phantasmal Image at Jordan. Jordan responds by using his foundry to convert one of his Thopters into a construct. He then blocks the phantasmal image, killing it. On second main phase, Nash then casts an Eternal Witness, returning Phantasmal Image to his hand. He then casts Phantasmal Image, having it enter as a clone of Gonti, Lord of Luxury. Jordan responds to this by flashing in an Astronaut's Altar, triggering Sai to make a Thopter. Nash then resolves the two ETB triggers, targeting one at Ron and one at Jordan. Nash follows this up by casting a Baleful Strix, and then Jordan responds with a Lotus Petal, triggering his Sai to make another Thopter. Jordan also casts a Soul Guide Lantern, causing Sai to make another Thopter. Nash then ends the turn. Ron draws for turn. And plays a forest as his land. He then attempts to cast a Jorga Warcaller, kicked 7 times, but Jordan responds with a Mana Drain. Nash then responds with a Nature's Claim, targeting Jordan's Mystic Forge. Jordan then uses his Soul Guide Lantern to draw a card. And with all that resolved, Ron then moves to combat and attacks Jordan with both Toski and the Soul of Harvest. Jordan blocks 2 constructs into the Soul of Harvest and 1 Trinket Mage into Toski. Ron then ends his turn. Jordan draws for turn. He starts things off with a Karn, the Great Creator, followed up by a Skull Clamp. Nash chooses to free cast his Force of Negation, countering the Skull Clamp. Jordan then tries to cast a Back to Basics, but Nash counters it with a Swan Song. Jordan then casts a Mechanized Production targeting his Thopter, and then passes the turn. Nash draws for turn. He then casts a Neoform, using his Gonti Lord of Luxury as the additional cost. He tutors with this a Reclamation Sage, and targets both Astronaut's Altar and Springleaf Drum with the 2 ETBs. Jordan responds by sacrificing both the Astronauts and Springleaf Drum to Sai's activate ability in order to draw a card. Nash then ends the turn. Ron draws for turn, and then casts Harmonize. He follows this up with a Chord of Calling, getting his Jagged Scar Archers into play. He then attacks Jordan with Toski. Jordan responds by creating a 1/1 servo, and Jordan blocks Toski with a 4/4 construct. Ron then casts a Heritage Druid on his second main phase and passes the turn. On Jordan's upkeep, Mechanized Production triggers, creating a Thopter. He then draws for turn. Jordan downticks Karn to get a Skull Clamp back from exile. He then attempts to cast Skull Clamp, but Nash responds with an Omen of the Sea. Jordan responds by flashing in his Hull Breacher, and Nash follows that up by casting Force of Will by pitching his Sire of Stagnation, countering the Skull Clamp. The stack resolves, and Jordan gets 1 treasure because of the replacement effect on Hull Breacher when Omen of the Sea ETBs. Jordan then ends the turn. Nash draws for turn. He plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn. He then casts a Deadeye Navigator. Jordan responds by drawing with Sai, casting a Mox, and then drawing with Sai again. Deadeye soulbounds to Nash's Phantasmal Image. Nash then flickers Phantasmal Image, having it enter as a copy of Eternal Witness. He then neoforms his Gonti in order to tutor a Sidisi Undead Vizier. He exploits Baleful Strix and the Sidisi, Nash then necromancies Sidisi, exploiting twice, sacrificing Reclamation Sage and Birds of Paradise. On end of turn, Ron flashes in Yeva, Nature's Herald. Ron draws for turn and plays a forest as his lane. He casts Dwennan's Elite, which when it enters the battlefield creates a 1/1 elf. He follows this up by casting a Druid of the Cowl. He then casts Merwin the Nurturer, and then he uses Jagged Scar Archer to kill the Thopter with Mechanized Production enchanted to it. Ron then moves to combat and swings with Toski at Nash, who blocks with Sidisi. Ron then ends the turn. Jordan draws for turn, and then casts a Narset, Parter of Veils. He follows this up with a Bide and Nathotha, triggering Side to make a token. He moves to combat, and attacks Nash for 3 with his Bird and Thopters. Jordan then casts a Spellskite on second main phase, and then ends. Nash draws for turn. He casts Yarok, Lotus Cobra, and a Spring Bloom Druid. The Druid triggers 3 times, sacrificing 3 lands and putting into play 6 lands. This causes 12 triggers on the Lotus Cobra, netting Nash 12 mana. He flickers his Sakashima to enter as a copy of Eternal Witness, getting back Birds of Paradise, Gaunty, and Rex Sage. He then casts his Phantasmal Image, copying his Sidisi, getting 3 exploits, sacrificing Sidisi, Birds, and Lotus Cobra. He then casts Intruder Alarm and casts his Gaunty. He then demonstrates an infinite by flickering Gaunty using Deadeye, and the Cryptolith Rite Intruder Alarm netting him infinite mana. He exiles everyone's deck and then passes the turn.